on career guidance, theory, policy, and practice. Just letting you know that now we are recording the discussion, so if anybody feel inconvenient being visually recognizable, you can turn off your camera, but as you wish, it's really up to you. And a warm welcome to John McCartney. I had really the privilege working with him for probably almost 1.5, 2 decades. And I think he's one of us who is like a living history of career guidance policy all around the globe. And as we warming in or moving into this discussion about critical perspective on career guidance policy, we really have a privilege, John, to welcome you here in this webinar. The idea is that we really let you to discuss the topic half an hour, 40 minutes. Probably questions will be also coming. I'm just asking the colleagues, if you want to ask questions either in the end, do that, raise your hand, or you can put it to the chat room and Petra is going to follow those, or even we can read your questions if you wish. So thanks for coming, John, and then the floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. It's midday in Cork, in Ireland, where I am at the moment. It's a great pleasure to be invited to address this seminar. The topic is one dear to my heart because I've worked at international level for the last 25 years, and so some of what I'm going to say today are really things that I have learned both from the practice and also from preparing the seminar. So I've included I've described it as the answer is blowing in the wind. Those of you who might remember that Bob Dylan song from 1962. And I think you might understand the answer by the time the presentation ends. Today, if I can move to the second slide, I'm going to look a small bit at the historical evolution of the international organizations and what's behind them. They're an example of multilateralism. So what does multilateralism mean? How has career guidance got onto their agendas? Because none of these organizations are directly supporting career guidance in the sense of that's the main goal or theme of the organization itself. I'm going to just briefly summarize their recent interests and activities. Talk a little bit about their membership and funding because that's important in terms of the context. Talk a bit about their impact on national policy and systems development, and then conclude with some of the limits of what these organizations are able to do. So if we go on to the next slide, please. Well, a big question for me is history predetermined, or is history just a series of historical accidents? But if we look, for example, at the oldest of these organizations, the International Labour Organization, it was set up in 1919. In essence, it was a response to World War I, but not only that, because as you know, the 1800s had significant international thinking around workers, capitalism, the socio-economic systems, and where exactly what were the roles and duties and responsibilities from one towards another. And we have that in the writing of Karl Marx, but we also have it in the writings of Pope Leo XIII. If we then go to the next slide, please. So if you look at what happened in between the First World War and the Second World War, well, you might remember that after the First World War, people said never again. So obviously they produced the League of Nations as an organization, of which the ILO became an agency. And that didn't really prevent wars between the First and Second World War. So if you look at what happened between the wars, there was kind of a return from multilateralism to nationalism. And again, that would be one of the, but not the only reason why the Second World War broke out. And then, as a result of the Second World War, another big push around multilateralism. So the ILO, the United Nations, was founded in 1945. The ILO became an agency of that in 1946. The World Bank was established in 1944, initially for questions of the reconstruction of Europe and all the damage that was done through the wars, but eventually had a more broad role in the world in terms of poverty reduction. And then we had the establishment in Europe, which we really needed, the Council of Europe, set up in Strasbourg, and that was looking at human rights, democracy, and the rule of law, because all of these things had been trashed literally all over Europe during the Second World War. Next slide. And then so in we go into the 1950s. And again, if you look, it's almost reaction to what had happened in the First World War and Second World War. The European Economic Community was set up, and while its essential role was developing a common economic policy among European countries, politically it was driven by trying to reconcile the nationalistic fervors that had created the world wars, and we see that in 1957 the EC was established, and then its administrative wing, the European Commission, set up in 1958. With a different kind of a role. And interestingly, the European Parliament has existed since 1958 as well, with only direct elections since 1979. So all of these were intended to have more stable, peaceful, secure economic and social Europe. And we also had the establishment in 1961 of the OECD, the Organization for Cooperation, Economic Cooperation and Development. But just to recall that this was originally a European organization for the implementation of the Marshall Plan in Europe in terms of post-war recovery. If you go on to the next slide. And again, it's kind of the winds of change affect affect the development of other institutions. So, for example, the European Economic Community had a common policy for vocational education and training. It was one of the founding tenets and principles and activities of the EEC. And when that enlarged in 1973, then instead of having a vet policy for 6 countries, you now had a vet policy for 9. So they established the CEDEFOP, the European Centre for Vocational Training, and that was established initially in Berlin. And if we can look at historically the disintegration of the Soviet Union in the late 80s and early 90s, I think Europeans saw a need for an agency that would assist the development of vocational education and training in these countries, and support the reform of education, training, and employment systems, because it was a huge turnaround for them. So the ETF came into existence at that point, and while its initial focus has been around the former Soviet republics, its more recent focus then took on the Mediterranean countries, the Eastern and Southern Mediterranean. We go to the next slide. And these are some of the principles that are principles and tenets that underpin multilateralism. So it's all voluntary. In a way, like people, if you even look at the European Economic Community or European Union, people vote to be part of it. And so, but there are different, there are limits to what voluntary activity is. Membership is voluntary. There's nobody forcing you to join. If you do join, there are certain things which, for example, you can have a recommendation coming from the ILO or from CEDEFOP or ETF, and nobody is obliged to follow. And the same for the OECD. So it's just to be aware that what are the limits of what can be done, and that's the nature of multilateralism. We go on to the next. And just to say again, looking the kind of things that I would include there would be compromise, because when we look at policies and policy positions, they're always compromises. I think in the world of academia and in the world of career guidance, practitioner client relationships, well, we do come across the issue of compromise. What do you choose for your future? What does that imply in the circumstances in which you're making your decision? And that applies also at intergovernmental level and international organization level. That sometimes decisions come out and we're saying, well, that's stupid, that's cuckoo, it's not 100%, it's only 50%. But these are all compromises. When these countries come together and decide on a recommendation, you have people who are maximalist, people who are minimalist, and a position has to be found within these. Okay, next slide. The earliest references to career guidance was really to vocational guidance by these institutions. They go back maybe to 1949, where there was an excellent recommendation by the ILO on career guidance that gave definitions, principles, methods, organization, training, and a very, very comprehensive one. But one of the ones that we are inclined to forget, particularly in the European context, is the Council of Europe Social Charter of 1961, where for the first time career guidance was regarded as an entitlement, a citizen entitlement in Europe, and that has framed policy in a very different way. Hasn't really been followed through very much at member state level, but it certainly is there is framing as an entitlement is really important. If we look then to the other international institutions, the European Commission in 1966 produced a really excellent recommendation, and it's one of the ones that I always love to go back and look at, because it was so well done and so practical at the time, including a reporting requirement that countries had to report annually. It was also around evidence-based systems development. So they were looking at different target groups and how to support them. But it said essentially that governments should undertake annual surveys to see what the needs are and whether the needs are being met. And I thought this was really, for me, it's one of the outstanding international recommendations, and still worth a while to look at, even though it's so many years out of date. On to the next PowerPoint. And what is interesting, really, if you look at the history of career guidance and vocational guidance, has been the links between that and vocational education and training policy. Just to try and keep in mind that in a European context, vocational education and training was a common policy issue for the EEC since its foundation, and that education only became a common policy issue from the Treaty of Maastricht in 1992. So in a certain way, the vocational education training has kept the flag flying for career guidance, vocational guidance, in a way that the education sector has never done at international level. And again, if you look at the ILO recommendation of 1975, it stresses the complementarity between vocational education and vocational guidance. Now, part of this, of course, is because the kind of attitude towards vocational guidance. Could you move to the next slide, please? So, because vocational education and training was really seen as a response to social and economic problems, and I think that's really important, okay, because it helps certainly employment. It helps employers in terms of skills needs, and it's very much related to the economy, all right. And in policymakers, it's easier to grasp and understand than, for example, to say, well, what's the connection between studying Latin and the economy? So just to look then at the role of CEDAFOP and of the European Training Foundation, the CEDAFOP has been involved in research and career guidance since the 1990s. Particularly in the 1990s, they were looking at disadvantaged groups, people who were excluded from the labour market, who had major barriers to access it, and it's only since the year 2000 that the European Training Foundation has got involved in and taking up career guidance as a really important element for economic and social development in the neighbouring countries to the European Union. And the point that I made earlier, that in essence, vocational guidance has been a pillar of European policy on VET, and we really have to thank the people who have driven EU policy on vocational education and training over the years to keep flagging the importance of career guidance. Now, they do it from a particular motive, all right? They obviously are concerned about the attractiveness of VET, and they will often criticise the existing education training systems, particularly the education systems, saying that they don't do enough to attract school leavers into vocational education and training. So they have obviously a vested interest on the one part, but on the other part, I think if we look at lifelong learning agenda, well, the lifelong learning agenda at the European level was not driven by the education section of the European Commission, but it was driven by the vocational training unit, or the vocational education and training policy unit of the European Commission. So it's important to recognize that, all right, and to give credit where credit is due, because they really have kept the flag flying. Okay, next, please. Now, the big winds of change, really, if you look at the year 2000, it was a really very significant year, and particularly in European terms. because we had the development of what was known as the Lisbon Strategy, how to improve the society and economy in a knowledge-based society and economy. And and they came up with the heads of governments in Europe, right? They really promoted this Lisbon strategy to make Europe a competitive worldwide economic power. And to do this, you had to reform the education and training systems and the employment systems. And to do any of that, you had to have a lifelong learning policy. And obviously, lifelong guidance comes in to support that. If we move on to the next. And some of the outputs of the Lisbon strategy, they tend to be forgotten because we're always caught up with what's happening today, what's the latest news on Trump. But really, some of the Lisbon strategy outputs have been really significant. For example, the European Qualifications Framework. Those of you who work in academia know how that works well. The development of national qualification frameworks to mirror the European Qualifications Framework. I mean, and these now are kind of standard instruments at an EU level, right, and statutory instruments, and that's really significant coming out of the Lisbon strategy. And then in all of this, of course, there was a recognition that you can't have really proper lifelong guidance systems unless you have, sorry, lifelong learning systems unless you have. And that ended up then at an EU level, EU Council of Ministers of Education, in adopting two resolutions on lifelong guidance, one in 2004 and one in 2008. And you also had the development of the European Employment Strategy. I'm sure Tibor will say more about that. And again, a kind of a reporting to see what are the targets each country should have and how they should implement those targets on an annual basis. But above all, what one could see as an outcome of the Lisbon strategy is increased cooperation between international institutions. At the start, in the Lisbon strategy, the OECD was very involved with the European Commission in framing up papers to look at how Europe could adapt and change. But that in turn then led to other areas of cooperation with the World Bank, with CEDEFOP, and with the European Training Foundation. If you come on to the next. So what kind of forms did that take? And the biggest, I suppose, input really was the international policy and systems reviews of career guidance, which took place mainly between 2000 and 2007, organized by the OECD, the World Bank, CEDEFOP, and the European Training Foundation. And these involved countries across the world, Asia. Sorry, when I say across the world, I would say probably all continents except Africa and maybe the Middle East. But you certainly had North and South America involved, you had Europe involved, and Asia, all right, and Australia and New Zealand. And part of this was done on a more kind of informal basis through the International Symposia on Career Development and Public Policy, which brought countries worldwide together to look at issues around the policy context of career guidance. It also led to the establishment in 2004 of the International Centre for Career Development and Public Policy, which was supported at the time by the OECD, by the European Commission, by the World Bank, as international organizations go. You had, and then at the European level, you had an expert group on lifelong guidance, and you had which was driven by the European Commission, and you also had a European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network that followed the expert group, and this network was made up of policymakers, practitioners, and different different partner interests. We have some of the European social partners on board for that as well. Next slide, please. So what are the major interests of these international organizations? And I've summarized some of them here for you. I mean, the career readiness is one probably that you all know about, and that was linked to the international assessments undertaken by OECD of student achievement. But just to say that it's not the only interest, it's the main one maybe that comes up, but also the OECD were involved in adult guidance in different research projects. The ILO, its interest has been around digital career guidance for workers, career development systems. But one of the things that's forgotten from the ILO, which I think is a really significant contribution, and it doesn't really come from their career guidance side, and these are labour market surveys, national labour market surveys and analysis, a lot in developing countries, because in a lot of developing countries that kind of data is not collected or in a standard and systematic way, and these studies undertaken by the ILO are really critical for developing relevant education and training systems, and they're also critical for developing relevant career guidance systems. So for me, the ILO is a significant contributor, maybe indirectly as well as directly. In the case of the ETF, they have really been doing a lot of work with neighboring European countries in undertaking country case studies, country reviews. And UNESCO, just to say that UNESCO really has a very limited role. It has always had a very limited role. It really links with TVET, but it doesn't really seem to look beyond. It doesn't seem to link career guidance with anything beyond TVET, and that seems to be the practice over the years. Okay, if we go on to the next slide, please. On the other hand, if we look at CEDAFOP really has been hugely productive, right? It runs a network of policy experts at national level, and it's called CareersNet. They have a super collection of information on policy and systems in the EU 27 member states, all right, on their website. But it really is continuously working away on this. The World Bank was very involved in the early 2000s, but once David Fretwell, who was the lead on career guidance in the World Bank, when he moved on from his role in 2004, 2005, the whole area of career guidance seemed to have disappeared. And the only thing that we have of any kind of recent vintage is a newsletter, just one issue in 2023, that really I'd say was probably pushed by the European Training Foundation. So that interest was very strong, and then it disappeared. And it's just slightly there at the moment. The European Commission keeps an eye on things. I mean, it looks at general policy direction. It looks at what are the kind of main economic and social strategies of the member states over a period of 5 to 10 years, and how career guidance fits into that. And it also runs two networks, the European Public Employment Services Network and Euroguidance. But in essence, it was way more active from 2000 to 2010, and and then it kind of diminished gradually, and certainly after the end of the European Lifelong Guidance, um, the ELGPN, European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, and when that finished in 2015, it like the EC seemed to draw back rather than get further engaged. Um, and I just mentioning our own organization, ICC DPP, our research interest has been looking at career guidance in the public employment services worldwide in association with the World Association of Public Employment Services. In essence, we have acted for the last 21 years as a kind of an stop, shall I say, a one-shop stop for all the other organizations, because we collect theirs and we collect their publications, reports, studies, etc., and we bring them to the attention of the public through the monthly newsletter. And we post them on our website. So in a sense, we act as kind of a library or repository of what all the other organizations do. Okay, can we move to the next? Um, but the latest network on the block is known as the IAG, the Interagency Group. And the Interagency Group on TVET was established back in 2017. And involved in it were people from CEDAFOP and from the European Training Foundation, among others. And these two, the ETF and the CEDAFOP personnel, pushed for career guidance to become a topic of one of the work groups. And that subsequently has happened in 2021. And these groups bring in UNESCO and the OECD and the World Bank and the European Commission. And they have produced the joint statements in 2021, revised and published just recently, 2025, investing in career guidance. And they also undertook joint research in which we were involved in on guidance post-pandemic. And also they are responsible for the Global Careers Month, which is currently this month in 2025, and the previous one had been in 2022. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? So just a small bit, brief descriptions of these organizations. The OECD covers 38 countries, but other countries can actually buy services from the OECD. The OECD has kind of a core funding and core activities, but it undertakes other activities with that countries have to pay for. So if, for example, you're not one of those 38 countries and you want a review of career guidance in your country by the OECD, you'd have to pay dearly for it, you know. So it's just to say they operate on a base on a contract. They are also contractors and maybe subcontractors. The ILO, obviously a worldwide body, has a huge budget, and so has the World Bank. But the World Bank has other roles. Career guidance hardly figures in it at all. So if you go to the next PowerPoint. Yeah, and so here you can see again that some of these are easier to manage because they have smaller numbers. CEDAFOP is responsible for 27 member states. ETF has 28 partner countries, neighboring countries, and the European Commission has 27 member states. So in that way, but if you looked at the budget figures, and you can look at them later, the budget figures are significant, and career guidance would be part of that general budget. It wouldn't have a specific any specific line. And I just threw in our own budget just for comparison. We operate out of an annual budget of 16,000 euros. So in comparison to these, we're a really small fry. Next PowerPoint. So what about the impacts? Excuse me. Well, the most important one is really the highlighting of the significance of the context in which practice takes place. Because if we look back over the years, practice and policy were never associated, and we had lots of practitioners who were working and who would be very frustrated but couldn't see why the governments weren't giving more money or developing the services better, and couldn't see the policy context in which that happened. And it would also be true to say that policymakers equally were ignorant of where career guidance fitted into policy. So I think that one of the impacts of these international organizations is to highlight the policy and systems context, which really hadn't been paid attention to by practitioners or trainers, but also hadn't been really paid attention to by policymakers. And it also kind of clears the air to show how career guidance is a policy instrument to achieve a range of social and economic goals for society, and that is not an activity in isolation. I mean, when we see an individual on a practical basis, we're trying really to help them to work their way in a way to visualize and to plan their futures, and they are our subject. We're not thinking of the work that we're doing here as contributing to any social and economic goal, but in fact it is. All right. And the same would be true even in training. If you're, when you're training, as some of you are trainers today, when you're training guidance practitioners, you're thinking really in terms of uh, how to train them to operate in the roles in which they have in the education, training, and employment services. But we're, we're we don't really see them as trainers. We don't really see that, in fact, we are also part of supporting social and economic policies. And I think it's important to. I think that the focus on policy and systems by the international organizations has helped to rebalance that in some way, because I think in the past, as practitioners, as trainers, we tended to operate in policy vacuums, whereas now I think people are a bit more conscious. Oh, okay, we're doing this, but it's also to achieve other broader societal and economic goals. Okay, the next, please. And from the work of the international organizations, um, uh, they have developed a methodology for reviewing and evaluating career guidance policies and services, and that's really and that's significant. We didn't have that up to the year 2000. They've also developed guidelines for policy and systems development, and through the kind of council resolutions or organizational recommendations, they provided compasses for national development. And I think that's important. Like they have been really significant and maybe in some countries more than others, because as I said before, OECD can make recommendations, the European Council can make resolutions, but countries have to do the work themselves, and so they can either do it or not. They can listen or not listen. Next slide, please. They've also been great in terms of providing, through the networks and through events, providing opportunities for mutual support and sharing of policy learning and expertise. And they have, through their recommendations, provided a stimulus for national policy and systems reforms. And they've also focused our attention on the importance of evidence collection. And that goes all the way back to 1966 European Commission recommendation. Like when we think of it in the countries that we have very little studies of people's needs. Sometimes I think that governments are afraid to look at people's needs because they might realize that the needs are far greater than they're actually investing in. And so I think that that the evidence base is not just an evidence base to prove the value of career guidance. An evidence base is also needed for what are people's real needs and how career development services can respond to these. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now what about their limitations? Well, the first thing is to say that the resources that each of these organizations give to your guidance is very limited. I mean, like you've seen the size of the budgets, you see the number of countries that are involved. But if you were to look at the actual personnel working in these, in CEDAFOP, you have one person, but that person also has to do other things, because the organization isn't about career guidance. So she is to look or can be called on to contribute, across the board around career guidance, but also being asked to do other things. And the same is true in most of the international organizations. The human resources devoted to career guidance are very, very limited, and so are the financial resources. It's a very small part of the mission. And one of the things I think that comes out as well is that while for example, you might have council resolutions, OECD recommendations, ILO recommendations. The fact is, to put these recommendations into practice, you have to put money and human resources. And you also have to have a monitoring system. And by and large, there isn't a monitoring system. It's just absent, right? It's just, we'll make the recommendation, we'll hope that people will do something. And if they don't, well, what do we do? All right. And so that's really kind of the frustrating part, or one of the frustrating parts of this. Okay, and the final PowerPoint. Yeah, I just to say that in all of these organizations, while career guidance might be at a particular point in time something that's really important and recognized by the organization, as well as points it disappears. And the case of the World Bank is really a one to follow on that. Once the person left, when David Fretwell left, the career guidance, nobody seemed to follow up and take responsibility for that. And it can also happen that career guidance within these organizations is competing with other policy priorities of these organizations. So it's not as simple as it looks. It's not the way. They're not dedicated to career guidance, and the people who are within them, they have responsibilities, but they also can be given other responsibilities, and they can also be told, well, this thing is more important than career guidance, and you got to do this. And so the consistency of interest isn't constant, and then there's the big concern about the corporate memory. Sometimes it's very frustrating for me in particular to see that the European Union, through some of its programs, still finances projects which are really reinventing the wheel. There are things that have been done before, things that have been done better by other networks, setting up networks, and really is. I don't mean the cost network, by the way, but there are some projects still on the go, network projects, which are small, funded around career guidance, and you're wondering, where do these fit into the ecosystem, to the policy and systems ecosystem? And they don't, right? So like there are a lot of frustrations on that. So to come back then to the theme about blowing in the winds, right? Part is that the winds blow in a certain direction and things happen. And sometimes gentle breezes blow and things happen. And then other winds come from a different direction and things get blown out. So in essence, there has been really, would I say, since the year 2000, there's really been consistent action by several international institutions to put forward the whole area of policy and system development for career guidance. But it's not on an equals basis. They all can't be equally involved because of the nature of their organizations. They've been they can get blown aside too, or career guidance can get blown aside in their own agendas. So it's just to be conscious that it's a constantly changing situation, and you can't take it for granted that what's a policy priority now in one organization will be the same tomorrow. So I stop at that and happy to answer any questions or hear comments.
Great, thank you so much, John. That's very thorough kind of historical account and a lot of influences mentioned. Just while we get people to think about it, I don't see any hands up now and there's nothing in the chat. So I have a question for you while we're waiting for other questions to come. And I'm just wondering, could you give us a weather forecast? Could you give us an idea of where do you see the wind blowing in the future? So you've kind of led us up to this point and talked about the challenges with new players coming in and corporate memory kind of being lost at times as well. But where do you see it going from here on?
Well, it depends really on which organization and which level. I think the strength of the organizations at the moment is the fact that they're now operating as a network, right? Because the individual organizations will have different priorities. If, for example, the reconstruction of Gaza, all right, or the reconstruction of Ukraine, if there's a change of government in the Soviet in Russia, right? You know, all of these things can kind of bring up priorities as to what to do next. And I think at the moment, internationally, governments are suffering really from the inconsistency of trade policy with the USA. So it's in a sense, we're in a state of flux, and it's impossible to kind of put a finger on and saying it'll go this way or it'll go that way. But I think that the strength of the interagency group is really what will try and hold career guidance in their vision for the future. And so I would be hopeful, but I couldn't say that any of these organizations will either do more or do less.
Thank you. Have we any other questions from anyone in the group? And as Tibor said earlier, you can put something in the chat or just raise a hand or unmute to come in.
Sorry, I was typing, but maybe I'll be faster if I just speak. Thank you so much, John. That was a very efficient summary and very neutral as well. I'm very interested to know more of your opinion and with your knowledge and experience and wisdom of what might have been missed opportunities in terms of work that could have been done and which could have been crucial by the international organizations, or one in particular, and from that side, but also what could have been missed opportunities from the side of, different countries, or at least uptake of policy.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and I'm not sure that the answer is very clear. I would say, for example, at a European level, the death of the European Lifelong Guidance Policy Network, to my mind, was a tragedy, right? Because it had made significant progress in trying to help countries to implement some of the council resolutions of 2004 and 2008. But it stopped in 2015. It was no longer a priority of the Commission at the time, and it just got lost in the way. And that in fact was a very interesting network because it was member state led, and therefore action was more likely to happen in a member state led network than in an international organization led network. All right. So if that opportunity, that's one that would jump out for me. Another might be looking at at times some of the organizations haven't had sufficient funding to do external reviews of career guidance systems in different countries. I'm thinking European Training Foundation as being one. So sometimes they've had to limit what they do because of financial cases. So some of the external evaluations would it become internal evaluations rather externally led evaluations, and that would be to me a missed opportunity. But the internal national evaluations were still beneficial. I still think that the external element was really helpful in the case of the OECD and the World Bank and the ETF and the other ETF case studies. Yeah.
Thanks, Christina. Thanks, John. Any other questions?
Well, I can't see more so far, but probably colleagues are still observing and then digesting what they just heard. Aha. So one more question is coming from Maria. I think the question is about the role of practitioners, if I'm just reframing what is written here. So what should be the role of the practitioners in order to influence policy design and program elements? But Maria, if you want to add yourself, just you can activate your mic and go ahead yourself.
Do you want me to answer, Tibor?
I think go ahead. Yeah, please.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, my reaction would be to get involved locally with your national association. In essence, an individual, it's very difficult for an individual practitioner to be able to bring about change. That's not to say that they can't, because if, for example, they're a friend of a minister of education or a minister of vocational training or a minister of employment or a minister of social inclusion, then they actually can have quite a lot of influence. But in general, practitioners, I would see getting involved in the local association and in their national association, and also for national associations to start looking at some of these policy issues. For example, like we have cases in countries where we have legislation concerning the provision of career guidance by schools, by employment services, and so on. But we have very little evaluation of the implementation of these legal frameworks for career guidance. So, like, there are things that national associations can do to try and focus, and they have to, in a sense, have a role of being policy advocacy or being policy advocates, which is not their traditional role. I mean, their traditional role has been more around, how to improve the quality of practice, right? And it has been less around, well, where are we in this policy setup what legal instrument has set up, and how is that legal instrument being implemented, and are adequate financing and resources given to it? What kind of research is being done on the needs of the population? So and how can governments respond to these? So there are actually a lot of, what shall I say, almost like macro questions or strategic questions that national associations can raise, all right, and can advocate and can follow through on in a way that you as an individual practitioner can't really do.
On the other hand, I don't have any friends in the ministries or somewhere, so I represent my private practice. The majority of my clients are like over 40 who are career changers. And I saw that the focus so far is low educated, as I saw, individuals, migrants, etc. Many of my clients really are very concerned about their future after 50. Tomorrow I have to present one action plan to a client of mine that he is over 50 and he really wants to see what will happen until he gets pension. So this is the kind of customers I have in my private practice, and I would like to bring that. I don't know if it helps. I just wanted to share this with you. Yeah. Thank you.
Just following your question and also the answers, what came to my mind is always try to bridge the gap in training, how we are training guidance professionals. Then now, if you are studying the recent Finnish competency framework for guidance professionals or the Canadian, one chapter of this describing policy design and policy rationale. So in career guidance, it's mainly employment policy, social inclusion, and educational policies. And then I think we also have to understand the level of understanding of the professionals about policy design, because end of the day, in every government, in every country, policy design is a bloody business when there is a continuous fight for limited resources. Yeah. And then I think very often the case that guidance professionals simply not able to capture policy debates or understand the language that policy decision makers or politicians themselves in the high level are using. So I see that like as a two-way street, not just a one-way.
Yeah. Maria, I would just come back with another point, and that is that in the most recent OECD outlook reports, employment outlook reports, they did refer to the need for adult guidance in two specific contexts. One is the aging population and the aging workforce, and the need, in fact, to train up people who are older adults and going towards retirement. All right, and that was really a strong. At the end of an employment report, to refer to career guidance in that context was really important. And they also had a similar recommendation for the development of career guidance services for people who are moving from jobs in the gas industries or the fossil fuel industries, moving to jobs in the green side, right? So, and there are policy recommendations there for adults. They didn't, surprisingly enough, when they looked at artificial intelligence and the labour force, they didn't think that, well, maybe career guidance might also help adults who will be making that transition, from being in a non-AI environment to an AI environment. But it's there as well. So, in fact, the challenge is there for adults. I think part of the thing that, well, I won't say it depresses me, but it never ceases to surprise me, is that if you look at it, the school population, where guidance services in general are focused on youth, and you could say rightly so, because it's an investment in the future. But then when you look at the whole adult sphere, there's very, very little. I mean, the public employment services in many countries aspire to do things, but in fact, their program priorities often are very different. All right, so there's a huge, well, say, market there for people that you're describing.
Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you for the answer. I see two more questions probably before we need to close this part of the webinar. One is coming from Isabel. She's a career practitioner working in a school environment, and then recently she started asking feedback questions from the users. And then, if I'm capturing rightly the question, how can these feedbacks from the user group can influence policy design? That's one of the question. And the second question is coming from Liana, I think from Armenia, if I'm correct. As she's a newcomer in the discussion, her question is that what's the historical shift in policy design when we are talking about the using of AI in career guidance services, or have you seen any? And I'm also encouraging the participants, if misinterpreted your question, then just activate your mic so you can jump into the discussion. So once John going to provide answer to these two questions, I think we're going to close the discussion. Thanks.
So to take the first one, feedback from user group, I think that, and that should also be mentioned, should I say, as one of the outputs of the Lisbon strategy, and as one of the outputs of the career guidance reviews. I think, and it's a good thing to recall that up to the year 2000, and even into the early 2000s, I remember going to a meeting in France. I was working at the commission at the time, and I was sent down to talk to a national group in France, and I was asked about the user involvement in career guidance, and I encouraged it. I said, that people should have, the people who experience public services, private services, should be able to give feedback in order to help improve those services. And I remember being shot down in France, where people told me, well, the people who come for career guidance services, they don't really know what they want, so they can't really have any opinion about what they got. And my argument was, well, if services are supposed to be client-centered, right, then the client-centered also means asking them to say what, to reflect on what they got and whether it was useful. All right. So the involvement of user group is really, really important, and getting feedback for services is really important, because that's the only way it's not the only way, but it's a significant way in which services can improve. And I think that would be true of any public service, not just around career guidance. And how that can influence policies. Well, I think that policy makers, particularly in a European context, but not in other country contexts, but certainly European context, would they would take into account, or they more often take into account, users' needs than they certainly have in the past, and user feedback on policy design. So it's kind of current, but it might be only current in several European countries, but not necessarily something that's outside. So I think it's important to recognize that it's not just, it doesn't equally happen in all cultures and societies and systems. But it certainly can help that. As regards the AI issue, I don't know to what extent countries really have addressed that in I think if I look at the OECD report, I mean, the OECD looked at it in terms of helping workers in transition. But I think in the career guidance community of practitioners and trainers, and in the career guidance delivery services, I think time has to be given to reflect on how AI impacts on how we work, how we include it in how we work. It's a small bit the same for me as when computers came into career guidance 100 years ago, and people were saying, "Oh, computers are going to take over," and people now are saying, and then it was ICT. ICT is going to take over, and now it's AI is going to take over. But in fact, any of these are really instruments or a means to an end, and there's obviously a time lag between what is happening and how practitioners, trainers, and managers of services react and respond in a way that you can creatively use AI to improve services for people. So there's a time lag there, and I think we happen to be in that time lag right now.
Okay, thanks a lot for all of the questions and all of the answers. I think it's also time to close the webinar, or this part of the webinar, with that. Thanks a lot, John, for being available for this discussion. As one of your last comment in last slide was that institutional memories are sometimes shorter than individuals' memories. I also find it super important to put everything into the context that development of career guidance or career development policy haven't started by a fortnight, but it has a couple of decades history already. So whenever we want to be critical with certain policies, I think first we have to understand the stepping stones before starting our own ideas. So one more time, thanks for this. As it was agreed, then the workshop or the webinar was recorded, so it's going to be available online. Then I'm going to stop the recording, and may I ask all of you who are in the call to stay for another probably 15 minutes to discuss the next steps.